There are 294,000 religious congregations in the United States. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish traditions share a commitment to social justice. They shelter the homeless, feed the hungry, and provide counseling, health care, and daycare to those in need. Working together with elected officials at local, state, and national levels, faith-based individuals are making an impact.
I feel my dreams don't matter, that I am just too small. The game is theirs, the rules are set, and I don't want to play at all. But then I think of one strong voice who dreamed nighttime into day, who broke the rules and changed the game to one we all can play. We gather here because that voice makes it.
Hello, welcome to Making an Impact. I'm Gretchen Ike, and my guests tonight are two women very knowledgeable about the situation in South Africa. First, Andrea Young. Andrea has been with the United Church of Christ Board for World Ministries and Office for Church and Society as a foreign policy lobbyist and formerly as their Africa Missions Secretary. And she's also served as a congressional staff person and made 2 trips to South Africa in both capacities. Our other guest, Kanya Makabo, was a South African university student when the university she was attending was closed due to political activity on campus, and she eventually ended up fleeing South Africa and is living here in exile. We're delighted to have both of you with us tonight and are looking forward to learning more about the whole situation in South Africa. Since November of 1985, we've really been in the dark in terms of the U.S. public learning about the situation in South Africa because of the massive crackdown on the press and the prohibition on press coverage coming out of what's going on in the black townships. And so it's been very hard for Americans to know just what's going on. Both of you are wonderfully equipped to help us fill in the gaps of our understanding. I guess I'd like to start first, Andrea, with you. As an American going into South Africa in the occasions in which you did, what was some of the most striking learning, some of the memories that were most striking to you about what the situation in South Africa is like?
Well, I guess for me, Gretchen, one of the most powerful memories that I have of my visits to South Africa was sort of the contrast between a community that was the result of relocations and removals, a cornerstone of the grand apartheid policy.
The government forcibly removing people?
That's right. This was a community that was created as a result of people being forcibly removed from their homes. And one of the most prominent landmarks in this generally barren community was the graveyard. And in a relatively new community, the graveyard was very large. And as you know, in African culture, often mementos of the person are laid on the grave. And on many of these graves were the toys of children and babies. And so to see the terrible human cost of this kind of policy, of this graveyard on the hill, of this barren expanse of land with just hundreds of thousands of people.
What's the government's policy? What is this policy of forced removals?
Well, the policy of the government is separateness of the races, and so people are being taken, some forcibly, homes bulldozed, etc., away from places they have traditionally lived, some of them, for decades, if not centuries, and put into these Bantustans, these areas that the government has reserved for Africans. Since 1960, over 3.5 million people have been moved from their homes to these barren areas. These Bantustans represent about 13% of the land of South Africa, and the government's grand design is that almost 80% of the country's people would somehow be forced to live in these areas.
So is this sort of like large farming areas where people live, or what's the reality for folks who are removed?
Well, that's what's so striking, is that they're in rural areas, but they are not rural communities in the sense that people have enough land even for small gardens. The plot that an average family would have, would be like an American's garage. I mean, the entire thing, the room for the house, the yard, everything. And people were just dumped out there. Many of them were not even given anything with which to build a house, much less a house. And so the toll, the human cost, is just incredible.
And 3.5 million people forcibly removed.
Between 1960
Wow.
and 1985, and for a while, when there was all of this publicity about South Africa, the removals were stopped. But since then, they've resumed, and at least 100,000 people have been removed since then. There are plans now to remove an additional 3 million.
We hear a lot about the government policy of detaining people who are dissidents, people who are anti-apartheid, protesting the government's policies. Kanya, I understand you've had a lot of first-hand experience with that policy in your own life and with your family. Could you share a little bit about what that policy is like?
Yes, Gretchen, my first experience with detentions in the family was in 1976, when there was the Great Soweto Uprising and students came up in their thousands to protest against Afrikaans. My eldest brother at the time, who was in high school, was detained by the South African police, and for a long time we never heard about him and didn't know where he was, until as people were being released in little groups, they come out and tell you who else is in prison, and it is only then that we knew where he was and were able to go and see him and attend to him. He spent a greater part of the year in prison, so he lost the full year of school and had to start all over again.
What was he doing that got him detained?
He was at a college in Natal called Adams, and the protest started out in Soweto, but it quickly spread to the rest of the country and started out as solidarity, and later...
Is this violent protest, or what kind of protest?
It wasn't violent protest, it was marches.
Marches.
Students literally had placards and were marching to police stations to protest against Afrikaans, and some students were saying they're marching to Pretoria, which is the capital of South Africa, to throw the Afrikaans books away and say we need to be given a better education, and then the police started shooting on them. That's how everything really started. The first boy who was shot was Hector Peterson, and after that, when you are attacked, you naturally respond by attacking. And that's why he was arrested. He was part of that group that had protested and marched to a police station.
I understand that the South African police, and even down to the railway police and the bus police and the what we would call security guards in this country, have the power under the state of emergency to make arrests and to detain people without any charge, and to not tell the families, to give no information out as to where the families have gone. And that's what happened with your family. There was no knowledge as to where your brother was or whether he'd actually been arrested or not.
No, and they had just absolutely no right to legal representation. My parents tried to get a lawyer or someone who would go and talk to him, but it was just a closed case, and he was never, he was taken to court and back, but no formal charges were ever brought against him, and he wasn't convicted of anything, but he spent a greater part of the year in prison. And when you mentioned railway police, I had a first-hand experience with railway police. We were riding on a train to school, and we started singing in the train, in protest and everything. And the railway police stopped the train and came onto the train and arrested a great number of students who were on the train. So this really has it's increased in the later years, that every person who is in uniform can go out and arrest you for taking part in acts that are deemed. So
dramatic increase in the powers of the police, and they cannot be sued if they make mistakes.
Right, that's what the state of emergency specifically specifies, that they cannot be sued, they cannot be taken to court. And this just gives the government a long hand in defying human rights.
While the situation sounds increasingly desperate, one of the questions that we get asked a lot, those of us who work in religious communities, that are addressing the situation in South Africa is, why should the church be involved? Why should religious groups, particularly in other countries like the United States, really be involved or have much at all to say about the situation in South Africa? Isn't it enough simply to be concerned about what's going on here at home?
Well, many of us are involved, Gretchen, because we have long-standing church relationships in South Africa. My church, in particular the United Church of Christ, started with mission work in what's now the Republic of South Africa in the 19th century. So there is a church there now, the United Congregational Church of Southern Africa, that finds itself very much involved and engaged in trying to develop some kind of response and take care of its people. Its pastors are being detained and arrested. The state is making rules about how funerals can be conducted. I mean, you find young pastors being detained because they did a funeral for a member of their congregation.
Why would holding a funeral be a political act?
Well, because the state, because of state restrictions on public demonstrations, often a funeral of a person who died in any kind of demonstration or unrest becomes a focus then for the demonstrators. But at the same time, of course, as a pastor, it's your Christian duty and responsibility to minister to the families of people, to perform these funerals, and often, one must speak out as well about the cause of the deaths of these often very young people.
It seems that when church people in South Africa have spoken out, though, it's been quite dangerous. Your own church, Kanya, the Lutheran Church in South Africa, has had its Bishop Farasani, the second highest person in the Lutheran Church, has been arrested and tortured, I guess, on 4 or 5 occasions. That seems to be a fairly common phenomena for many pastors at the local level, right?
Yeah, Gretchen, any form of protest, it's illegal to say anything against the government. And as Andrea explained, that there's just no way you can avoid saying that this person was killed by the system of apartheid. And because of the bannings of many organizations, churches still remain unbanned, and they have served as a platform, for political happenings. And pastors have taken a very positive stand in fighting against apartheid. And I think more than anything else, it's apartheid is immoral. It's a sin. And I feel it's the duty of every Christian.
Just what is apartheid? What do you mean when you say that term?
Apartheid is Afrikaans for separateness. It means separating tribes and separating people of different colors and different races and keeping them in their own places. That's basically what apartheid is, and it's a very old system. I always smile to myself when people talk about apartheid. It's like it's only starting 10 years ago. It's been there when the British were in rule. It was there, throughout the colonial rule. And I always think there is no excuse for not taking a stand against apartheid and doing something positive, because it's been going on for centuries. And
actually, the resistance to apartheid is very old too, isn't it? It's some of the organizations that have been fighting apartheid, politically resisting, are as old as like 77 years or so. The African National Congress.
The ANC is 1912, and it started out as people would protest to take their passbooks, which are a document that had to be carried by every black South African, and throw them away. And the government responded by shooting people down, shot about 60 people down who were running away, shot them in the back. And after the ANC had tried to negotiate for many, many years, the ANC was banned and kicked out of South Africa. And that is when the ANC felt that the only way to hit at the South African government is the same way they are hitting at you.
You're saying that for the church is now, many of the churches are now kind of the last resistors that have not been silenced by the government. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, the government in 1988 in particular banned and restricted almost 30 anti-apartheid organizations. In a court case, the Delmas trial in November of '88, the judicial system ruled that it was essentially a crime against the state to advocate an end to apartheid, verbally, non-violently. That simple protest itself was treason. So therefore, the zone of operations for organizations within South Africa that are advocating nonviolent change is just severely limited.
And how has that affected the church? Has there been increasing pressure? I mean, we know of pastors getting into trouble, but are there other examples of problems the churches have experienced?
Well, absolutely. The headquarters of the South African Council of Churches was bombed and destroyed, made unusable.
Just in this past year, in
1988. The headquarters of the South African Bishops' Conference was also bombed. Other local councils of churches have had their offices bombed and destroyed. When I was in South Africa on my last trip, I visited with the Border Council of Churches in the Eastern Cape area, of the Eastern Cape and the Ciskei, and visited a squatter camp where people had been kicked out of one Bantustan and were just living in tents huddled by the side of the road. The local council of churches was trying to work with people, feed them, help them get proper documentation and so forth. And I have a picture of that group. Of those people, one is in exile and the rest are in prison or have been detained. So the kinds of oppression against the church, even just working to feed the poor and care for the needy, has just been incredible. It's difficult to believe. It's very difficult for an American to believe. We live in a country where there's such relative security that people can do these kinds of things to other human beings, that this kind of an evil system where the lives and humanity of people is so totally disregarded, can just continue to exist in this era.
The war that's essentially going on in South Africa, it is essentially, I think, at a war level at this point, is really being led by a lot of young people. And I wondered, Kanya, because you were part of that group, you were part of the student protest movement in South Africa. Could you say some things about what it's like to be a young person growing up, and particularly a young person on a campus, and what outlets are there for you, and what presence do you see of the police and the military, even there on the campuses, as people try to organize nonviolent marches, demonstrations, etc.?
My personal experience with the military occupation of campuses has been, in a totally non-violent. We were not violent on campus. We were just protesting against specific lecturers who would pass derogatory remarks like, black people cannot think.
Professors who would say something like that?
A professor who would say,
protest.
How can you people understand science? Your ancestors used to sit around a fire and discuss national matters. Your intelligence only goes around the fire. And we just felt that this was, the final straw.
And these are faculty paid for by the
professor who is paid for by the government, a white professor. And we felt that we just didn't want him there. He shouldn't be benefiting from our tuition and passing such derogatory remarks. And we protested against his presence on campus. And this college was in Ciskei, which has been classified as a homeland by the South African government.
The Bantustans Andrea was talking about earlier.
And the police immediately came on campus and started beating us up and put a curfew on campus, took everyone in army vehicles and took them to prison. And for the rest of the year, there was this a curfew. You could only be outside campus within certain hours, and this was under police escort. The police would literally escort you to your classroom and escort you back to the rooms and dormitories, as you call them. And a very large number of women were raped by this police on campus. And after the authorities finally decided to close off the school, a big percentage of the lecturers resigned in protest of the raping and the non-dismissal of the lecturer and the varsity was rendered, you know, useless because there was no staff or anything like that. And everyone was kicked off campus, and the only way you could come back was by being reissued with a document where you had to sign a pledge that said, I will not take part, I will not take part in any other political demonstration against the school. And at the same time, identify people who have been taking the forefront in this demonstration. And this sets people against each other, right? Because you know how your parents have suffered to bring you to this college, and you feel, well, I have to choose between my friend and my parents. I'll probably choose my friends. And that's how many people went back to school, the great pressure that parents were putting them under to go back.
Both of you are related to groups in local congregations who are trying to do something about the situation in South Africa. The United Church of Christ South Africa Task Force in this area, in the metropolitan Washington area, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has a task force in the same, constituted to do the same thing, to raise consciousness in local congregations about the situation and figure out ways to help people do something here in the States about the situation in South Africa. It would be helpful, I think, for our viewers to get some sense of what your own local church-related task forces are saying people can be doing. We do have some materials also to share with the viewers as to study materials that can be used in congregations. But would you share a little bit about how people here can do something, what they can do?
Well, there is right now beginning something called the Stand for Truth campaign, which is a coalition of churches and different faith communions to try to really take up the banner of the churches, because the churches are in crisis in South Africa, because they right now are virtually the only group that can really speak out against the oppression of apartheid, and yet they are suffering as a result. So we have a Stand for Truth campaign that we will continue to speak out on their behalf. One of the first segments of that campaign is the Pentecost to Soweto campaign, which is from Pentecost, May 14th through Soweto Days in June, when we will commemorate the Soweto student demonstrations that Kanya has referred to. Another campaign is for political prisoners, and I think that probably Kanya knows.
It's called Adopt a South African Prisoner, and this is done in conjunction with the National Democratic Lawyers Association in South Africa, who defend the political prisoners because they cannot afford to hire their own lawyers, and in many times these court-appointed lawyers tend to find them guilty before even talking to them. And the National Democratic Lawyers Association put this project together with the South African Women's Day Committee, which is based in Washington, D.C. And good progress has been made. And what is happening is that people who are interested in the project send their names into the South African Women's Day Committee, and then the South African Women's Day Committee in turn sends them to South Africa, to the national...
People can send their names into national offices here, probably national church offices in the U.S., and those names get sent on to South Africa to be matched up?
To the different task forces in the congregations, and then the names get matched up in South Africa. That way the prisoner has the first option to write. And if they read about the person and feel comfortable with the person, then they initiate the writing. I
remember hearing Archbishop Tutu speaking a year or so ago about how much difference it made to him to know that people, I remember the illustration he used was a woman up in Canada who she wrote to him that she was praying for him every day at a certain time, and that there was something very sustaining about knowing that people in various parts of the world whose lives are very different from your own have that constant vigilance and care, both in prayer and in advocacy, writing letters, trying to raise consciousness to the fact that you're there. When you're talking about your brother and how long he stayed in prison, invisible, nobody knowing where he was or what had happened to him or whether he was alive or dead, you can imagine how important this opportunity to really be connected personally with a political prisoner in South Africa would be for that prisoner. Yeah,
and not only for the prisoner, but for the the American who's also writing the letters. It makes them identify this oppression with a specific person, and the person is encouraged to write, when we call for a campaign, to write letters to the South African embassy and protest against this. It's like, I'm writing on behalf of Kanya. I know Kanya, she's my friend. I've been communicating with her by mail. And
so the materials that are there for us to use in study in our congregations include the Stand for Truth Till South Africa is Free material, the Kairos document, which is a study document from the church in South Africa, which many congregations have been finding very helpful to use here, as well as the Adopted Political Prisoner Campaign. One last question to you. What we hear increasingly from church people within South Africa, despite the fact that it's treasonous for them to advocate this, is that the United States government and other governments around the world need to put as much economic pressure on the government of South Africa as possible. Can you say just a couple of words about the importance of sanctions and why sanctions has been called for by all of these national religious organizations in the U.S. and in South Africa?
Yeah, the UCC is working very hard for sanctions. It's one of our legislative priorities. And the sense is that comprehensive sanctions against the South African government, particularly multilaterally applied
by many
the
countries
U.S.,
at once.
Japan, West Germany, Britain, these major trading partners with South Africa, can bring South Africa to negotiate a new system in South Africa the same way that they are now negotiating in Namibia, that the limited sanctions produced enough pressure for negotiations around Namibia. There'll be an election in November to elect a constituent assembly to write a constitution for all the people of Namibia. Those are the kinds of steps we want to see happen in South Africa. And what we hear from inside the country and from people in exile is that comprehensive sanctions is the nonviolent pressure that can achieve that.
And I also feel it's important, for the Lutheran Task Force on South Africa is one of its main aims is to get the Lutheran Church to get its money out of South Africa.
So as much economic pressure by trying to get money out, get corporations to leave, and also to apply comprehensive sanctions to be able to force the government to understand that it must accommodate the 87% of its population that's been being grossly mistreated and receiving a great deal of violence and oppression from its own government.
A democratic, non-racial South Africa, that's what the ANC has been saying since 1955.
We thank you both very, very much for participating in this Making an Impact show. It's been wonderful talking with you. We've learned a lot and look forward to a session again later. The next show that we do will be focusing on homelessness and housing, and we hope you'll tune in at that point to join us in Making an Impact. Thank you.
Sometimes I feel my dreams don't matter, that I am just too small. The game is theirs, the rules are set, and I don't want to play at all. But then I think of one strong voice who dreamed nighttime into day, who broke the rules and changed the game to one we all can play.